Welcome to Connecting Arguments with Illinois State University's Debate Team, the show for those craving academia after school. Connecting Arguments is designed to highlight the ways in which arguments are utilized in our daily lives and connect the public to what's happening in and around campus. In this episode, debater Jacob Kaminsky and Director of Debate Shanna Carlson interview sophomore communication major Donovan Hill Bush and the School of Communications Dr. Byron Craig about the creation of the Black Communication Association. We uncover the motivation behind the founding of the new RSO, the types of discussions the group plans to focus on, and finally relate the group's research to the greater Bloomington Normal community. So prepare yourself for a discussion regarding race, allyship, and activism.
Dr. Craig and Donovan, thank you so much for joining us today. We'd like to start off and ask if you could provide an introduction to your organization, what you're calling it, and what its goals really are for the two of you and everyone who joins.
For those who are interested, the organization is called the Black Communication Association, which is it'll be a Black focused organization in the School of Comm, which its goals being to showcase the importance of having a Black presence both in the communication discipline and in the communication industry, among other industries that need to have communication to excel in. We also will highlight Black issues that happen from outside our community, but also inside our community, because there are so many happening inside that we are starting to become very afraid to talk about, to discuss about. We also want to provide a space for Black students. We will support Black students and Black businesses on Illinois State's campus and in the larger Bloomington Normal area. And we also will try to unite Illinois' community of African descent.
Awesome. So along that line, Donovan, what encouraged you to begin the Black Communication Association?
It felt like a need after what's been going on over the summer. It wasn't something that I wanted to do. I really started thinking about this with myself, and I thought of it as more of like, this needs to happen. With everything that happened over the summer, the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, which I remember watching the entire video with my own mother, and just having her have the context of me wanting to take walks to stay fit. So now she has another level of worry every time she sees me go outside taking a walk. George Floyd, we couldn't even watch the full video. And I just remember participating in the protest as well. And Breonna Taylor's was actually, to me, possibly the most tragic one, because it happened when she was the most vulnerable, when she was in her sleep, and they did everything they can to not only destroy her character, but to also find other excuses so that they can justify the murder of an innocent Black woman. Yes. So it felt like a huge need to start this organization, and just the fact that we don't have this organization, or we don't have a lot of Black organizations in schools of communication, it really became a need. I started talking to people who I knew, for one, needed to have a great level of communication to excel in their fields, and people who I knew that when we have these discussions, they're going to provide a lot of insight. And I also dove deeper into it when it came to who I decided I wanted to have as leadership.
So that leads us really well into the next question that we have for you, Dr. Craig. And that is, what aspects of your current academic work and life really inspired you to be the academic advisor for the RSO?
So I'll say a couple things. So first, it certainly is an organization that's meant to kind of, help students who want to go into the industry and understand how the importance of communication. But it's also, and this is something that I made really clear to Donovan when he asked me about being an advisor, was that I want to make sure that there is a scholarly component to this also, right? Because of all these things that we see happening in our current public culture, and that our current public culture is constantly going to shift. There's going to be more and more things that will happen. We need to know how to both not only talk about these things, but to also look at them in a way where we can create strategies to work through these issues also. So I'm a rhetorician. My PhD is in rhetoric and public culture from Indiana University. So, for me, I look at I'm always looking at how do we critique these things, right? Without necessarily, I want to stand back and not judge so much, right? But I want to think about what are the different types of strategies that we use to make change when these types of things happen. So Donovan mentioned Breonna Taylor. We have a trail of information from that case, right? You know, we have grand jury information. We have police reports. Those are all documents that as a rhetorician, I want to look at, right? And see what's in there, what kind of theoretical gauge I can use to look at these documents. So it's important for me because a lot of my research is on visual culture in race, right? And so what we call visual vernacular. And I look at what are the tropes, these racial tropes that could make that police officer. In an interview with him, he said that why did he shoot? Because he said when he turned around and looked at me, he looked like the devil, right? And so these are racial tropes, racial stereotypes that Black folk have had to deal with. And so I think in this moment that we're living in now, an organization like this is really critical to have to help Black students and anyone who wants to come in and talk about these things grapple with why does this continue to happen, right? You know, we can march and that's important, but we have to understand, you know, why these things happen. We have to understand a history of policing in the United States, and that policing comes as a byproduct of slavery, right? And so understanding the history of this and finding historical records to look at these things, I think is what's going to be important when we have these kind of conversations. I know that one of the things that Donovan really wants to do is to have a space to really be able to talk about these issues. And this is something at ISU, this is a mission at ISU right now, is to make sure we're creating these spaces where students can talk, but also be inspired to go out and make change, right? Find ways to strategize. I like that, you know, Donovan's vision of being involved in the community is really important, because the community where the university is located, where any university is located, right? There's always been a separation of town and gown. Well, this helps to bring that together as well.
And I feel that this organization can be the one that really adds a critical note to a lot of these theories, and to hopefully influence professors just to add that critical note just by them knowing just a little bit of the knowledge of how this theory can affect whether or not we succeed, or if we don't succeed, or even if we live or die.
So I want to build off what both of you guys have been talking about. Donovan, would you say there's a specific audience that your RSO is targeting that these issues matter the most to them? And how are you trying to reach out to that specific audience?
If I'm being brutally honest, everyone, every single person on this campus, and even outside of this campus, to hear the stuff that we are going to talk about.
You know, one of the things that I think that's really important about this is when we talk about audience, in this era of reckoning that we're in now, you know, it's important that we understand that, first of all, it has to be empowering for Black students to be able to know that you have this space where you can come and you can start speaking this truth to power, right? But also in a way that helps a non-Black audience understand that these aren't just opinions or just emotions, right? These are facts. And if we're thinking about our audience, we know you have to have a notion of credibility also, right? So we're also saying, here are the statistics that show this, right? Here's the theory that we know exists that supports this argument, right, that I'm making, right? So whether we're talking about the universal and then the particular, or if we're talking about, you know, racial Anthropocene, these things are really important to address when we're in these spaces and in these moments. This is going to be a space where we're inviting faculty as well. I think it's really key to show faculty, since this is an RSO that's in the School of Communication, that, you know, we're showing our ability to also talk about these things in a way that is at a certain level, right? And this doesn't mean to exclude anyone who can't speak at those certain levels, right? But to help, while they're there, it helps them understand, here's what we're striving to do, right?
So for students that want to be allies to this RSO, right, how would you connect to them, and what can they do specifically to further the goals of this RSO?
I don't believe in allies. That's not a term that I use. I believe in someone who's an activist. So for me, I want you to understand that this has been happening. We've been getting killed this way for years and years. So what are you going to do to help me change policy? I prefer to know that someone's going to be an activist along with me, because an ally is more about sentiment. The role of emotion in this, we have to be really careful, right? Because if we start being sentimental about things at times, it can make us not want to do the activism that needs to be done. So, and I feel that kind of same way about when we talk about allies, right? I think an ally can be sentimental, but I need to know you're going to be out there marching with me, and you're going to want to, when it's time for me to go in and say, here's what I think needs to be done, I want to know you're going to be standing by me as an activist. And an activist to me means someone who actively wants change.
How can we, those that are activists already, how can they get and encourage people that are just allies to become activists?
It's really, part of that is really studying and understanding the history of the U.S. When we have all these books on, bias and, white fragility and all that stuff, those are fine. But I think you have to really read the history of race and racism and gender issues and inequality in LGBTQIA plus communities, all those fights that we've had to have, right? And understanding what all those things are historically, rather than reading about what someone says is white fragility, and then they go out and make hundreds and thousands of dollars doing workshops, right? And who can pay to be in those workshops? More wealthier white women, right? That's who those audiences are. The best thing that I can say is to understand what has happened to bodies that have been on the front lines, right? I can tell you, I've marched at times where I've had the Klan throw. I got hit in my neck by a brick by a Ku Klux Klan member, right? But I would have never gone out there and done that had I not understood the history and the people who were murdered and who were burnt alive in their homes out of white rage, right? And so I think when you talk about those things and you say, here's the things that you should be educating yourself on, here's what you should be reading, I think that can move people away from, if they're so prone, right? Everyone doesn't want to be an activist, and that's fine. If you'd rather be an ally, then understand the difference, though. Understand that an activist is going to be actively out there making change. But you have to get people to read and understand this history. But here's something else they can do. They can watch shows like Lovecraft Country. They can watch The Watchmen, right? These shows also give all this history. You remember when the first episode of Watchmen aired, and it took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and it was about the domestic terrorism that was done to the Black people in Tulsa, Oklahoma. More people were saying, what was that? Is that something that was real? We don't know our history. I mean, we know Tulsa is not a standalone issue. Right. This happened all over the country, right? In the 1920s and 30s. These things were happening. Anytime someone Black got a little power, a little money, those places were destroyed. So when we see these types of things or we read about them, we get more of an understanding. And let's say it this way. Even if you can make someone more civically engaged, then I think you're doing a really good job, right? If we can get someone to understand, if you're not civically engaged and you don't see all these things going on around you that need to be changed, well, that person just doesn't really probably care. And what are you going to do, right? I mean, you can't change everyone. You can't you can't make everyone feel like they want to be out there on the front lines, and that's okay. But I think you can certainly take someone who says, I'm an ally, and say, let me see if I can tip you over into being more of an activist with me.
I think it adds a lot to people that may not necessarily understand the different experiences people can have in this country based on the color of their skin. So I think these conversations, while difficult, are incredibly necessary.
And Jacob, it also helps build this notion of empathy, Right? It helps us to become more empathetic about the conditions of other people, the conditions of the poor, right? The conditions of those who are most vulnerable to environmental injustice, right? To gendered injustice, right? And you know, we can't leave people who have who are physically different than us. So you know, you know, understanding and reading about these things and seeing these, I think, you know, and helping us build a level of empathy. Right?
If I can add on to that,
Absolutely.
I don't even just think that's just a problem people outside of like the people outside of the Black community, but I also think that can also be applied to the Black community as well. Because it's one for us to know something is happening, but then it's also something to just know it's something happening, but then actually have all the information. And so so why is this happening? It's when you ask why, is when to go on to Dr. Craig, I apologize, Dr. Craig's Dr. Craig's point on difference between ally and activist. Like the moment you ask why something's happening instead of just knowing it's happening, that's when your journey to an activist begins, because that's when the research starts to become putting into. That's when you start reading the books. Like that's when you start learning about people's experiences. That's when you start watching the Watchmen, the Lovecraft Countries, the Dear White Peoples, all that stuff. That's when you start taking notes of these shows, films, short stories, and just combining them into your own personal individual interpretation on a certain issue.
Right? How do we make a connection from the academic world of like this critical literature, these theories, right, to the lived experiences, and how do we act on those to make some sort of like material change happen?
I actually think that they are actually experiencing it without even knowing it's there. Academia and communication theories play a big role in my life, whether I want to admit it or not. So it's applying these academic theories and these ideas and even these laws. If we have to even just talk about laws now, just talking about how we apply these to our everyday lives, how we might apply 2 or 3, 5, 10 theories just all at once throughout our entire day without us even knowing it.
So Dr. Craig, I'll go back to you really quickly on this. Do you think that there are like practical approaches that people can do or practices that people can get into to make the connection and make the bridge between, okay, this is what a theory says in a textbook, this is what's actually happening in an individual's real life, here's how those two connect?
You cover the theory really quickly, but then you make the little connections that make them understand, here's the importance of this reading, here's the importance of academia, right? To help you make these connections. Well, to help people understand what that is, you just give them practical examples to it, right? But I think it's also really important to leave people understanding, here's the issues, and here's what we just talked about, but here's the theory that goes along with that, right? And because I believe if we're not educating ourselves, I think as Americans, we're getting dumber and dumber and dumber because we don't read, we don't educate ourselves on the history of ourselves and where we are now.
So in debate, right, we use like this critical theory often to identify like significant problems that plague like the status quo, and then how that critical theory can work to like solving back for those issues. Do you think that there's a value in using critical research and critical theory to provide alternative ways to solve issues other than the traditional means? And is that an effective strategy to materialize the change that we talked about by being an activist?
I've always said that if journalists and politicians use more critical theory, we'd be a much better world, right? But I think having good policy starts from using critical theory in whatever field you're in, understanding a critical theory that you can then turn into your everyday practices. Right? So I don't mean to sound, I don't like to sound like I'm, an elitist about intellect, but I do believe we have to become more intellectually sound as a world. I think right now we're too concerned about getting people out there into a career, but you can't just go into a career and not know how to be a critical thinker.
Do either of you have any final closing thoughts?
I want to give a special shout out to Donovan for really You know, when we came back in the fall, he contacted me and said, you know, this is something I really want to do, and explaining the reasons why he wanted to do this. I mean, I couldn't say no to being an advisor for it because his thinking was just so on point about it, right? And understanding the need for this kind of inclusion to have these safe spaces, right? Or what we used to call hush harbors, right? This space where you can go. We needed hush harbors during slavery because if you talked about certain things out in public, then you were going to get whipped or lynched or killed, whatever, right? Well, lynched and killed are the same thing. So we create these hush harbors, these safe spaces. And that's for me, that touched me because I'm like, this isn't the tradition of what Black folk have been having to do. And I see in this young guy, you know, this young cat, he's doing this thing that is part of our tradition, right? And he's carrying this on. And it's important work that he's doing.
If people are watching this right now and are like, I want to get involved with this RSO, where do I go? What would you tell them?
Oh, well, for one, contact me. My school email is djhillb@ilstu.edu. You can contact me. You can contact Dr. Craig, and we can both give you more information. This is something that we are both very passionate about.
Today, we spoke with sophomore communication major Donovan Hillbush and the School of Communications Dr. Byron Craig about the founding of the Black Communication Association and their plans to involve campus and local community in improving the world around us. Remember, an advocate is someone who actively seeks change in the world. Hush spaces are a historical necessity for Black individuals to discuss issues, and that BCA hopes to make complicated theory accessible to all. In the description below this episode, you'll find an array of sources to engage with to expand your own understanding of the concepts we discussed today, as well as the contact info for our guests. Illinois State University's debate team would like to thank all of you for tuning in and learning with us. We know there are a lot of options for you to listen to, and we appreciate your time.